One night, two women were sleeping on their beds in a big farmhouse. Then, at the dead of night, one of the women would be woken up by what seemed to be a very bright light. And after observing in horror what was right in front of her, out of fear, she would quickly wake the other woman sleeping next to her. And when the other woman woke and saw what she saw, she immediately came to a sudden realization on what she was seeing. And with what she had seen, out of fear, she would quickly cover their faces with a blanket, and both of them would just lay there throughout the night, hoping that the daylight would just break so they can leave that house. Their spooky story is known as the Binstead haunting, and would come to be one of the various terrifying documented cases of haunting in Canadian history. And today, I'll be sharing the rare first-hand story of one of the women who encountered it with you. But before I get into the full story, if you're a lover of disturbing, dark and mysteriously spooky stories, then you might consider subscribing to our channel, turn on all post notifications, and gently tap on the like button if you find stories like this interesting, as I'm still working on a lot more. Also, make sure to stick to the very end to get the full satisfaction of this story. And with that said, let's get straight into it. Not much was known about Georgina Mary Ward. However, a great deal was known about her family. Georgina's father was a man by the name of William Ward, who in 1817 was a director for the Bank of England and one of his era's most celebrated cricketers. Her father had 4 sons and 2 daughters. The sons of who were named and the daughters of who were not named, but in which going further, I found out that Georgina was one of the 2 daughters. The eldest of Georgina's 4 brothers was William George Ward, who attended a college in Oxford. In 1840, he would be ordained an Anglican priest before converting to Roman Catholicism in 1845. But that was after some sort of notoriety following his heretical religious beliefs. He believed that the only hope for the Church of England was to submit to the Church of Rome. Another one of Georgina's brothers was Arthur Ward, who was an ordained priest and who by all accounts had a distinguished career at the Cambridge University. So this was relatively a family that were brought up academically and religiously. Hence, this excellent reputation from Georgina's family does suggest, however, that she was brought up in a prominent household and had good social standings, just like her brothers. In 1850, Georgina Mary Ward got married to her husband by the name of Arthur Penny. They were Victorians from England. The Victorian era was the period of Queen Victoria's reign as of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which lasted for 63 years. That was from 20th June 1837 until her death on the 22nd of January 1901. During the Victorian era, it was typical for the wife to be remembered only by her husband's name. Hence, Georgina was also referred to as Mrs. Arthur Penny, or just Mrs. Penny. While there was no existing portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Penny which I could use for this video, however, I would continue to use their names throughout this story. Georgina, whom I would also refer to as Mrs. Penny, was also a respectable English matron of good Victorian stock. And since this story took place in the 3rd quarter of the 19th century, very little was known about her or her husband. Although her husband appeared to have been one of those Victorian gentlemen of indeterminate occupation. But we do know that in the summer of 1855, which was 5 years after their marriage, Georgina's husband, Mr. Arthur, brought her together with his servant from England to a town known as Charlottetown, located in the Prince Edward Island of Canada. In early 1856, Georgina and her husband Arthur would move to a 2-story white farmhouse called the Binstead House. Now, I will visually give you a layout of this house. The Binstead House was 5 miles away from Charlottetown, which is the capital city of the Canadian province of Prince Edward Island. The Binstead House also peered towards the Hillsborough River and was surrounded by fields and trees. The house also had many windows with a ground level columned porch. Further layout of this house also revealed that the back half of the house was considerably extended to serve as a living quarter for the many farm hands who were employed by the family during that time. This was also possible since there were about 200 acres of farmland around the house, hence necessitating several resident farming men. Although this extended backyard formed part of the house, the premises could only be entered through an inner kitchen, as no wall had ever been broken down to form a door or passageway from the upstairs floor. Hence, the farmers' sleeping rooms were adjacent to those occupied by the family and visitors, even though there was never any sort of communication through the upstairs corridor. By all accounts, it was a good-sized house. During the first week of beginning their life in Canada, both couples would begin the process of settling down at the Binstead house, while developing social relationships with the people living within and around the area. However, about 10 days after Mr. and Mrs. Otterpenny had established themselves in this house, that was when they would start noticing and eventually witness something very strange. In that house, there was also one of the spare bedrooms that was near the sleeping apartment immediately adjacent to the men's sleeping rooms. And this was the bedroom that more of these strange occurrences would be first witnessed. Around the farmhouse, Georgina, Otto, and several of the farm workers would begin to hear unusual noises. For several weeks, these noises would begin to occur frequently and would be heard simultaneously in every part of the house. And the noises would always appear to be in close proximity to whoever heard it each time, especially during the night when it was time for sleep. At night, they would hear sounds which were more like rumbling, which would begin to make the whole house vibrate. Then immediately after that, they would hear another sound which sounded like the noise produced by dragging a heavy body across the floor of the entire house. This occurred frequently, and as spring came on, the strange occurrences took an even more terrifying turn. The residents would begin to hear painful shriek sounds, which would grow fainter or louder as if something was being chased around the house. But it would always end after reaching a climax of shrieks, sobbing, wailing, moaning, and half-uttered words, which were being spoken and heard with sounds of movement throughout the house, as though someone who was in pain was moving throughout the inner walls of the house. However, whenever Mr. and Mrs. Penny and other residents or workers living in this house heard those sounds at any moment, they would spring up from their beds to go check the source, and they would never seem to see where it was coming from or who might be making those disturbing noises. These disembodied cries would always begin and end from beneath a tree that stood at a little distance from the dining room window, and the branches of this tree nearly touched the window of the spare bedroom above, where this unexplainable phenomenon was first witnessed. Even though these strange and mysterious noises heightened by spring of that 1856, they continued throughout the rest of the year. At night, the strange noises would proceed at the base of the tree, the shrieks continued, sobs and moans were heard around the house by Georgina and Otto, including the half-uttered words which would come from beneath that tree standing close to the dining room window. Even with the various unexplainable sounds occurring practically on some nights, the Penny family continued to live in this house. But it would be a year later, around February 1857, which was during the late winter, that the source of these sounds would come to be witnessed as to whom or what it might be coming from. On the night of a particular day on that February 1857, two ladies close to the family had come to visit at the Binstead house for one night, and these two women were to share the spare bedroom. These two women would be referred to as Mrs. M and Miss C. The spare bedroom had a fireplace, and within the fireplace was a fire grate. This particular fire grate had not been previously used by the Pennies, as they hardly used these spare bedrooms. They had their own main bedroom, and so this room was kind of reserved for visitors, or sometimes just for use when they feel the need to use it. However, during this particular night, a fire would be lit in the grate so as to help the women keep warm. Now remember, this was during a winter period in Canada. After a busy day, night came, and when it was time for sleep, they headed into the well-lit room and then shut the door behind them. As the night progressed, nothing much happened as would have been expected during the other nights when strange noises and occurrences would be heard throughout the night. It was the dead of night. The night was quiet. The air outside was chilly. Snow filled the ground outside the house, and there were no sounds coming from the chirping of crickets. But it would be around 2 o'clock in the early morning when Mrs. M, one of the two ladies sleeping in that spare bedroom, would be awakened by something a little foot away from their bed. She had seen a bright light which filled the entire room. M had seen a glowing woman in a checkered shawl standing by the fireplace. The little check shawl were crossed over her bosom, and on the left arm of this glowing woman was a young baby. And with her right hand, this glowing woman would slightly stoop towards the fireplace and begin to stir the ashes and the fire in the fire grate. M, on seeing this strange woman, froze for a second and started observing what she was doing. After a while, she would immediately begin to push C to wake her up. And just then, the figure who knew the two women were now awake turned her face towards them and was now looking directly at them. At that moment, Miss C, who was now waking up and seeing what Mrs. M had seen earlier, realized she had previously heard some stories concerning the house which some people said was haunted, and which neither Mrs. M nor Mrs. Otto had ever heard. The glowing woman's face disclosed the future of a young woman, and she was directly looking at them with an anxious pleading anguish written all over her face. So, jumping to that terrifying conclusion that she had just seen a real ghost, she screamed in fright and pulled the bedclothes and blankets tightly over her head and that of her fellow companion, Mrs. M, to cover their faces and to avoid seeing or knowing what the ghost was going to do next. After this spooky encounter, nothing much happened and no one got attacked. But the next day, both ladies, when narrating their encounter to several other people in Binstead, talked of how she noticed a frilled cap on the woman, making them assume that the ghost was that of an Irish woman, since one could observe their love for white frills in their headgear. The report left Mr. and Mrs. Penny contemplating the reason behind the strange occurrences happening within their home. However, it wouldn't stop there. Later that spring, just a few days before both couples, Mr. and Mrs. Penny, went to visit their native home in England. Georgina was to spend the night in the spare bedroom that had previously been used by both ladies who had come over for a visit. That night, Georgina's little daughter was very sick, and when it was time for sleep, she had her daughter's bed waiting beside hers, so she could easily attend to her daughter should she need any sort of care or attention. The night was quiet, and no odd occurrences would be heard. But it would be around 12 o'clock when Georgina got up to give her sick daughter some medicine, and as she was feeling around the room for the matches to light up the room, her daughter would call her attention to a very bright light shining under the door. But Georgina would tell her daughter that it was her papa. By papa, she meant her husband, Otto. She was like, "It's okay. That's just your father, nothing to worry about." But to admit it to her daughter, she went ahead and threw open the door, and immediately she did that and the door was now open, she found herself face to face with a woman. The woman had a baby on her left arm with a checkered shawl crossed over her bosom, and around this woman was a bright, pleasant light which shone all over the hallway just outside that spare room. While Georgina was looking at this lady, she could not tell where this light was coming from or seemed to be coming from. The light kind of was all around this strange woman. At that moment, the strange lady would look at her with an agonizing look, like that of someone who was in great emotional or mental pain. After exchanging a couple of stares with each other, the lady wouldn't enter the room and without a word, walked across the staircase, then vanished into the opposite wall which was exactly where the farmhand quarters were situated. After this strange encounter, neither Georgina nor her daughter felt the slightest alarm, even though it was possibly their first experience of encountering a ghost. At that moment, despite what they had just seen, it just appeared to be a matter of common occurrence, and when her husband, Mr. Penny, would eventually come upstairs, and Georgina told him what they had just seen, he would examine the walls, the staircase, the passage, but found no traces of anything extraordinary. Surprisingly, during that encounter, not even the dogs barked to indicate a ghostly presence. As you know, you would expect the dog to do, as they often react to auras and energies that humans cannot see. On the spring of 1857, the family would travel to their home country of England to stay for several months. After they had done their business in England, the Pennies would return to Binstead the following year, which was in 1858. With their return to the Binstead house, they would receive a report from the farm workers that the strange creature or the strange woman had continued with those paranormal activities after they left for England. The noises, moans, shrieks, and sobs never stopped. And according to the farmhands, it was the screams that had worsened since they left. The ghost never stopped screaming every day and every night, and the screaming sound distressed them the most. However, one person in particular was targeted the most during the time they were away in England. This person was a young man who was also a farm servant by the name of Harry Newbury. The rest of the farm workers had told Mrs. Penny that the apparition had visited Harry several times. They had seen it happen a lot of times, but Harry would choose not to tell anyone as to why this entity had singled him out. And one of the farmhands would talk of how he could hardly get Harry to tell him more about why this ghost had chosen to haunt him. However, this farmhand would say that Harry acknowledged that a ghost with a baby had appeared several times, standing at the foot of his bed. But that was just it. Harry would not tell him more. However, in the days before discovering the frequent encounter between Harry and this ghost, after a day of hard work, Harry was always careful to lock his door before retiring to his bed, and he would never share his room with anyone. At the time, they noticed the odd behavior, but they hadn't attached any sort of importance to that, as they felt he was just extremely private. But looking back now, after they discovered this series of disturbance mostly directed at him, they could now see why he was always quick to lock his doors and never allowed anyone to his room. One night, Harry had been so much disturbed in mind by this haunting that at the middle of the night, another man who was also a farmhand happened to hear voices and sobs coming from within Harry's room, which was just next to his. This strange and mysterious encounter would carry on in the Binstead household throughout 1858, and more unusual sounds would continue to be heard, and the Penny's family wasn't able to get an answer as to what was really behind this eerie phenomenon occurring within the household. It would be in the autumn of the following year, which was in 1859, that the Pennies gave up the Binstead house. After ceasing their connection with the Binstead house, following almost 3 years of ownership, both couples would return to Charlottetown, which was still within the province of Prince Edward Island, to live a normal life away from the ghostly disturbances. While living in Charlottetown, Georgina never heard anything else about the hauntings. It would be 2 years later, which was in 1861, that Mr. and Mrs. Penny would move from the province of Prince Edward Island to Saint Anne de Beaupré, a town in the Canadian province of the French-speaking Quebec, or Quebec as it's known in French, 960 kilometers away from Charlottetown. It was in Quebec, or Quebec, that they got to live the most part of their life in Canada. In the autumn of 1859, after Georgina and her husband gave up the Binstead house and went to live in Charlottetown, she had used that opportunity to look further into the happenings, and she became acquainted with the following facts, which seemed to make those ghostly experiences a little more clearer. It was while visiting her family in 1884 that she wrote her own account of the haunting that happened in Binstead. This was what she learned, which she told the Charlottetown Daily Examiner newspaper, as was retold in 1889. It would turn out that the ground on which Binstead stood had been cleared in around 1840 by a rich English gentleman known as John Levet Esquire, who had built a very nice, magnificent house. Getting tired of colonial life, the man would sell the house to a man whom Georgina forgot his name, but would refer to the man as Pigot, as that was the closest sound of the man's actual name. She couldn't remember the man's name again. Remember, it had been more than 2 decades ago when she did the research into the house. Although the man would later be identified as Charles Braddock by one of the critics who didn't believe her story. Georgina would refer to this Pigot man as a man of low tastes and immoral habits, but he was a commercial farmer. This man was also the one who had added all the back wing of the house, which extended the house. He was also the one who made the necessary divisions to get the various rooms and other offices needed for farming the land. During the man's time, this Pigot or Braddock had many farmhands, and 2 of those in his service would be 2 sisters who would turn out to be the daughters of a laborer who lived in a regular hovel around 3 miles near the town. After some time of being employed on the farm, these 2 sisters gave birth to a boy. Apparently, it was Braddock who had gotten them pregnant. Hence, the sons were described as illegitimate. At the time, very little was learned of the domestic arrangements in the Binstead farm during Braddock's time, since according to Georgina, the man had a bad name and reputation. Hence, the house would often be avoided by respectable people. However, what was certain was that during that time frame of the 2 sisters giving birth to their sons by the same man, one of the sisters and her baby was said to have disappeared altogether, never to be found again. When and how she and her son disappeared remains a complete mystery to this day. When the other baby by the other sister was between 1 and 2 years old, Braddock would sell the Binstead house to an English gentleman known as Robert Albion Fellows, who seemed not to be interested in the farming business. He was the man from whom Georgina and her husband had rented the house from in 1856 with the intention of eventually buying it, but which they never did, possibly due to the haunting. Shortly after her sister's disappearance, adding to the mystery, the other sister would quit her job and move to her father's house, where she would later leave the baby with her mother by the name of Mrs. Newbury, and would then move to the United States of America, and has never returned ever since. Before leaving, she would reveal nothing except that the baby was her missing sister's son, and that her own baby was dead. She never said what caused her son's death or where her sister was. She just left for the United States. The name of her sister's son, the one who was still alive, would turn out to be Harry Newbury. In case you have forgotten, Harry was the very young man that Georgina and her husband had unknowingly employed as a farm servant in the Binstead house, and who was also singled out by the ghost during their time there. Georgina would reveal that a few months after they left Binstead in 1859, Harry would come over to bid her farewell while telling her he was leaving Binstead and would never return there. It was 1877, 21 years after relocating from England to Canada, 18 years after leaving Binstead for Charlottetown, and 16 years of the Penny's family living in Quebec, that Georgina would happen to return to Prince Edward Island, where she spent several months. During her second spell in the island, she would one day visit a bishop's residence. Now remember, she was a Catholic Christian, and considering her brother's prominence in the Roman Catholic Church, it was no surprise to find Mrs. Penny visiting the Bishop of Charlottetown. During the visit, the parish priest of the church would approach her with a letter in hand, which he handed over to her. The priest was a native of the Magdalene Islands who spent 3 years at the Cathedral Parish after being ordained in May 1876. The priest had come to ask Georgina some questions based on the house she lived earlier on at Binstead. The priest first started by asking Georgina on whether she could throw any light on the contents of the letter. Apparently, the letter came from the wife of the current owner of the Binstead house, who had previously asked the priest to come over and try to deliver them from the tormenting ghost of a young woman with a baby in her arms, and who had appeared several times in their home. It would turn out that when Georgina and her husband left from Binstead to Charlottetown, Robert Fellows, the man who sold the property to them, took over the Binstead residence again, and after trying unsuccessfully to sell or let the property out, in 1867, 8 years after, he would finally dispose of Binstead for the sum of £1,100 to a man by the name of John Clark Binns. But the man wouldn't stay there for long, as he lived there only for 3 years before eventually dying. Binstead, which was formerly known as Fast Fen Farm during the early 1800s, was said to have been renamed by a rich, gentle Englishman by the name of John Levet Esquire before the house passed to the Binns family. Ultimately, after John Clark's death, the house would pass to a man called William Carey, who was the C family in this story. They had also witnessed this too, meaning that more than 2 decades after Georgina left that house, this ghost lady never left the property with the child. They had requested a right for exorcism during that time frame Georgina had come to visit the bishop in 1877. During their meeting, Georgina would tell the priest about the haunting she had experienced during their own time in that house. After this very unsettling account from Georgina, she would also inquire about Harry, only to find out that true to his words, since he left, he had never been seen in Prince Edward Island. Georgina deduced that the ghost was Harry's mother, and the infant in her arms was his cousin, though it was unknown as to whether the mother and the infant had both been murdered and buried under that tree in front of the dining room where the strange noises and apparitions would usually begin and end every night. It was also unknown as to the reason why the babies had been switched. According to Georgina, in a first letter which she had dated on the September 24th, 1887, she would mention another spooky story on how 10 to 15 years earlier, before relocating from England to Canada, a young lady had recounted being very terrified on sleeping alone when she was on a visit at Binstead due to the screams she would hear outside. The young lady had also seen the woman with a baby passing through her room. After spending some time in the province, Georgina would eventually return to Quebec. In 1888, 11 years after her second spell in Prince Edward Island, Georgina would return again to the province where she had come to interview the priest who had handed her over the letter back in 1877. Unfortunately, the priest was now on his deathbed, and while on his deathbed, Georgina would ask him about the latest developments in the house, and the priest recalled he had traveled to Binstead for the exorcism. However, he could not remember what he was told with regards to the ghost hauntings. The other lady, by the name of Mrs. M, who first saw the figure before waking Mrs. C, had gone to England ever since, and no one knew of her whereabouts. During her short return to Prince Edward Island, Georgina would once more stop by to visit the Binstead house. The next year, which was in January 1889, the priest would die after his long illness. Georgina, who was curious to know if the hauntings had ever ceased, would make her inquiry, and what she found out would be reported in a second letter dated on the January 23rd, 1889. This was just over a year after her first letter. She would say that the tree where the scream starts from had been cut down, while the room where they all saw the ghost was now totally uninhabited, and Mrs. Carey would not let them stay over in that spare bedroom where they had all witnessed the apparition. She had also asked them not to speak further on the subject. However, they were able to get a little bit of information from Mrs. Carey's husband, Mr. William Carey, even though Mrs. Carey was always following them closely. The man would mention that since the priest came over to bless the house, a woman had been seen. Before he quickly corrected himself and told her that rather said to have been seen around the front entrance and once at an upper window. This gave the feeling that the exorcism never really worked and that the spirit was still haunting them in that house. After this short exchange between Georgina and this family, it apparently concluded her investigation into the Binstead haunting. On November 28, 1889, the Charlottetown Daily Examiner would publish this eerie account directly from Georgina Penny under the title Real Ghost, as she told a haunting that had lasted for decades. During the late 80s, the memory of the Binstead ghost would linger only faintly in the community of Marshfield. However, ownership of the house would eventually pass from the Carey family to a certain Hertz family around 1890. Over the course of their generations-long occupancy of the Binstead house, a family member would recall hearing about the story and the newspaper accounts of the house as a child, but neither he nor his 5 brothers and sisters ever saw or heard anything strange or unearthly while they were growing up in the house. Neither have their successor ever been troubled by the supernatural, making more people doubt the story of the haunting. On December 22nd, 1889, a Marshfield native, a man by the name of Donald Ferguson, who was one of the biggest critics of Georgina's story, would write a letter expressing his denial to the allegations Georgina had made on Charles Braddock. Remember, he was the man of whom 2 sisters who worked under him suddenly vanished out of the town, with one of them who was never found. Because Ferguson had quarreled with parts of Mrs. Penny's story, stating that Georgina may have deliberately claimed to have forgotten Charles Braddock's name, only referring to him as Pigot in a bid to attribute the haunting to his rumored misdeeds. With this, Ferguson discredited her entire story. This was not really fair, as an observation made would reveal that an average ghost story consists of 2 elements. First, the account of the experience, and secondly, the interpretation of it by people, with the second element being where the story usually seems to go astray, and the story becomes colored by superstition and fanciful theories. However, this was precisely, or should I say, the major problem Ferguson had with Georgina's story. Although he admitted that Braddock had his faults as the man was addicted to the use of intoxicants, but otherwise, he was a good neighbor. It was also revealed that on March 16, 1849, a baby did actually die at Binstead during the period Charles Braddock owned the place. The baby would later turn out to be Charles Braddock's youngest son, although another son would be born the same year the previous one died, which incidentally was the year Braddock sold the house to Robert Fellows. What really transpired at Binstead during Braddock's tenancy can only be conjectured. Working backwards from the date of his departure in 1849, the terrible but unnamed incident that allegedly gave rise to the haunting would have occurred sometime around 1847 or 1848, and although Georgina stopped short of saying so, she had clearly implied that Braddock kept the 2 serving sisters as mistresses, with both girls having, in quotes, his illegitimate babies, and that one sister and one child came to a violent end at Binstead and were buried under a tree beside the house. This was the tree where the strange noises and apparitions would usually start from. Again, much of this story hinges on Mrs. Penny's character, although other people have also been said to have observed the apparition. While some groups have doubted her story, so many details of her story did not convincingly disprove it either. Her credentials as a respectable matron were impeccable, and she was obviously an intelligent woman who wouldn't seem given to irrationality. Hence, there was no apparent motive for her to fabricate a story. When fact-checked, the details were mostly accurate, and with the exception of the Pigot-Braddock mistake, the most serious challenge to her credibility was the absence of Harry Newbury, who wasn't seen from contemporary records and who had left Binstead after the apparition targeted him for a while. But while his name didn't exist on records, that by no means proves that he never existed at all. As for me, personally, I do believe this haunting happened. But for you listening to this story, I would like to know what you think about this story, and do let me know if you wish to see more stories like this, as I absolutely find them interesting. As of today, the mystery remains, and Binstead still keeps its secrets.